Olympics are one of the most prestigious shows of competitive athleticism in all of history. Athletes who qualify to compete and represent their countries possess world-renowned talents. The games are internationally recognized, and the tradition is historic in itself. But looking back on America's first time to ever host the Olympics, one would certainly challenge that particular assessment. The 1904 Summer Olympic Games could better be described as a comedic disgrace. The Olympics of 1904, officially known as the Games of the Third Olympiad, were highly sought after by a handful of major cities all vying to be that year's Summer Games host. Philadelphia and New York were on the short list, and although highly considered, were inevitably beaten out by Chicago for the chance to become the first city in America to host the Olympic Games. Well, that was the initial decision made by the International Olympics Committee. Then American imperialism took over, and the IOC's hand was forced to change their decision by another, far more influential entity, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The exposition's well-funded organizers had plans to be the organization behind the World's Fair that year, which was going to be held in St. Louis, Missouri, the same summer the Olympic Summer Games were scheduled. Former Missouri governor and president of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, David R. Francis, enlisted help from United States President Theodore Roosevelt to stage somewhat of their own type of coup to have the events held in St. Louis. A deal was struck between the exposition and the Amateur Athletic Union to hold the 1904 Track and Field Championships as part of the events of the World Fair. Olympics founder Pierre de Coubertin reluctantly abandoned plans for Chicago and moved the 1904 Games to St. Louis when faced with the possibility of conflicting athletic competitions being an issue. Coubertin neglected to attend the Games and later went on to write, "I had a sort of premonition that the Olympiad would match the mediocrity of the town." With the modern rebirth of the Olympic Games being only in its third year, there wasn't much to go off of to predict how St. Louis may fare, being the first American city to host the Games. The Second Olympics of 1900, held in Paris, France, was of course the most fresh on the minds of fans and critics alike, and naturally was used to anticipate what was possibly to be expected. As opposed to the first modern Olympic Games lasting a mere 10 days from April 6 to the 15th of 1896, the next two Olympics lasted far longer. The Second Olympic Games of 1900 lasted a grueling 167 days from May 14th to October 28th, and the Games of 1904 weren't far behind, totaling 146 days lasting from July 1st to November 23rd. Statistically, the most similar notation to mention is the number of events each year held, both coming in at a total of 95 each. The number of sports these events divided into were very similar as well. In 1900, 20 sports were competed in, and 19 sports in 1904. 11 of the sports these events were categorized in were played in both Olympic Games. With both years each having 95 official competitions, it's not surprising that the total number of medals awarded were fairly close as well. 254 medals were won in 1900 and 280 were won in 1904. 10 nations received medals in both years' events as well. Both host countries dominated their nation's games, but in France's time as being the game's host, they acquired 112 of the 254 medals, accounting for 44% of the total wins. The second most medals won was by the United States with 48, equaling to 19% of the medals won. Totals in 1904, when it was America's first time to host, resulted as such. The U.S. earned 239 of the 280 medals, making the percentage of medals won by America 85%. In second place, Germany took home a mere 13 of the wins, equaling almost 5% of the total medals. The United States accounted for 90% of total athletes represented their host year, in comparison to France's host year garnering only a total of 72% French athletes that competed their year. Of all the nations that could have been a part of this international event, only 12 nations bothered to show to the 1904 Olympics, as opposed to 24 participating during the Games of 1900. Transoceanic travel was extremely slow and expensive, and wasn't viable for everyone having to make the trip self-funded, thus the reason for so many countries deciding to skip the events. In France, of the 997 total athletes who participated in the Games, 975 were men and the remaining 22 were women. The women athletes were allowed to compete in a total of 4 events, including sailing, golf, tennis, and croquet. A number of these women athletes either won or placed in several events. There were also a number of firsts and broken records that the women of the 1900 Olympics achieved, showcasing the fact that women definitely could hold their own and compete alongside their male counterparts. America was less inclusive of women's athletics. There was only one event that women were allowed. Archery was the singular event in which 6 women competed, with only one woman placing with 2 gold medals won. The only other event women participated in at all was boxing, but any match women stepped into the ring for were considered display events and no medals were awarded. At the World Fair, which was going on at the same time as the Olympics, one of the more infamous events occurred on June 5, 1904, when a bullfight had been scheduled to take place in an arena just north of the fairgrounds. Then Missouri Governor Alexander Monroe Dockery ordered police to halt the fight in light of Missouri's anti-bullfighting laws. Disgruntled spectators demanded refunds, and when they were turned away, they began throwing stones through the windows of the arena office. While police protected the office, they didn't have sufficient numbers to protect the arena, which was burned to the ground by the mob. Surprisingly enough, the Exposition Fire Department responded to the fire, and disruption to the rest of the fair was quite minimal. One of the more unusual controversies of the 1904 Olympics came during the boxing competition, when a fighter named James Bollinger entered under the name of a popular local boxer, Carol Burton, in the hopes of currying favors with the judges. The imposter succeeded in winning one match before he was found out and disqualified. Alongside traditional Olympic sports, the 1904 Games also included a bizarre and highly controversial event known as the Anthropology Days, which took place on August 12th and 13th. As part of a two-day contest, so-called uncivilized tribes were recruited from the World's Fair's human zoo exhibits and encouraged to try their hand at Olympic sports. The results of individual native athletic performances during Anthropology Days were used to rank primitive peoples within a hierarchy of cultures. People from different tribes were to participate in traditional Olympic events such as the long jump and archery, as well as made-up contests like pole climbing and mud throwing. Anthropology Days organizer James Sullivan smugly concluded that the events were proof that the savage have been a very much overrated man from an athletic point of view. Others labeled the event a demeaning and racist sideshow. Olympics founder Pierre de Coubertin called Anthropology Days an outrageous charade and noted, "It will of course lose its appeal when black men, red men, and yellow men learn to run, jump, and throw, and leave the white men behind them." Honestly, everything about the Games in 1904 created such a failure that the 1906 Athens Games became known as the Games that saved the Olympics.
Invité à inaugurer.
In my opinion, the marathon of the 1904 Olympics can be described very simply. It was a mess. The race took place on August 30th of that year, lasting a distance of 24.85 miles or 39.99 kilometers. 4 nations represented the 32 athletes that competed, but only 14 managed to finish the race. There were many reasons for the lack of finishing runners, which we'll get into later. The marathon was conceptualized for the St. Louis Games to honor the Grecian heritage and emphasize the connection between the ancient and modern. But from the start, this particular marathon was less showstopper than sideshow. The outcome was so scandalous that the event was nearly scrapped for good. Very few runners were previously recognized marathoners who had either won or placed in the Boston Marathon or had placed in previous Olympic marathons. The majority of the field was comprised of middle-distance runners and assorted so-called oddities. Americans Sam Miller, A.L. Newton, John Lorden, Michael Spring, and Thomas Hicks, all experienced marathoners, were among the favorites. Another American runner, Fred Lors, did all his training at night because by day he worked as a bricklayer. Lors earned his spot in the Olympics by placing in a special 5-mile race sponsored by the Amateur Athletic Union. More on him later. Among the leading so-called oddities, there were 10 Greeks who had never run a marathon, 2 men of the Sawana tribe of South Africa who arrived at the starting line barefoot, and a Cuban national and former mailman named Felix Carbajal. Felix raised money to come to the States by demonstrating his running talent throughout Cuba, once trekking the entire length of the island. Upon his arrival in New Orleans, he had lost all his money on a dice game and had to walk and hitchhike to St. Louis. Luckily, once he arrived, Felix befriended the men of the American weightlifters team, who provided him room and board as he prepared for the marathon. At 5 feet tall, he presented a slight but striking figure at the starting line, attired in a white long-sleeve shirt, long dark pants, a beret, and a pair of street shoes. One fellow Olympian, an American discus thrower, took pity and found a pair of scissors to cut his trousers at the knee for him. At precisely 3:03, David R. Francis fired the starting gun and the racers were off. But it didn't take long for things to go awry. The heat soared into the 90s and humidity levels were high, with the path being wound across roads inches deep in dust, including 7 hills varying from 100 to 300 feet high. Dusty conditions, heat, high humidity, and a lack of water stations caused many to have trouble merely breathing. There were only 2 places where athletes could secure fresh water. One from a water tower at mile 6 and a roadside well at mile 12. Cars carrying coaches and physicians motored alongside the runners, kicking up dust and letting out toxic exhaust fumes from the early automobiles, all of which obviously didn't help anyone in the breathing department. James Sullivan, the chief organizer of the games, wanted to minimize fluid intake to test the limits and effects of purposeful dehydration, a common area of research at the time. So to top it all off, the runners were literally used as human guinea pigs. In many stretches of the race, cracked stone was strewn across the roadway, creating hazardous footing, and the men were constantly having to dodge crosstown traffic, delivery wagons, railroad trains, trolley cars, and even people walking their dog. The conditions conspired to force 18 of the 32 competitors to withdraw from exhaustion. William Garcia of California nearly became the first fatality of an Olympic marathon when he collapsed on the side of the road and was hospitalized with hemorrhaging. The dust had coated his esophagus and ripped his stomach lining. Had he gone unaided an hour longer, and he may have bled to death. American John Lorden suffered a bout of vomiting and gave up. Lin Tao, one of the South African participants and one of the first 2 ever Black Africans to compete in the Olympics, was chased a mile off course by wild dogs. Felix Coverhall trotted along making good time even though he paused to chat with spectators in broken English. On one occasion, he stopped at a car, saw that its occupants were eating peaches, and asked for one. Being refused, he playfully snatched 2 and ate them as he ran. A bit further along the course, he supposedly stopped at an orchard and snacked on some apples, which turned out to be rotten. Suffering from stomach cramps, he had to lay down and take a nap. However, for accuracy's sake, I do want to mention that according to one historian, George R. Matthews, the story is false. In his book, America's First Olympics, the St. Louis Games of 1904, Matthews states that there is absolutely no record of Carvajal stopping to eat rotten apples and becoming ill. Matthews recounts that Carvajal had a jovial demeanor, he joked with the officials and competitors, and he grabbed some peaches from a reporter, but that's about it. Matthews pins the source of the tale to Bill Henry and his book, The Approved History of the Olympics, published in 1948. Henry wrote his book with the approval of Pierre de Coubertin, which we all know did not see or support the St. Louis Games in any way. So in my opinion, these particular details are not 100% irrefutable. Sam Meller, at one point in the lead, also experienced severe cramping. He slowed to a walk and eventually stopped. At the 9-mile mark, cramps also plagued Lors, who decided to hitch a ride in one of the accompanying vehicles, waving at spectators and fellow runners as he passed on an 11-mile car ride. Hicks, which was one of the early American favorites, came under the care of a 2-man support crew at the 10-mile mark. He begged for them to give him a drink of water and they refused. Instead, they sponged his mouth out with warm distilled water. 7 miles from the finish line, his trainers fed him a mixture of strychnine and egg whites. This was the first instance of recorded drug use in the modern Olympics. Strychnine in small doses was often used as a stimulant, and at the time, there were no rules about performance-enhancing drugs. Hicks' team also carried a flask of French brandy but decided to withhold it until they could gauge the runner's condition. Meanwhile, Fred Lors recovered from his cramps and emerged from his 11-mile car ride in the automobile, which was coincidentally beginning to have engine problems. One of Hicks's trainers saw him and ordered him off the course, but Lors kept running and finished with a time of just under 3 hours. The crowd roared and began chanting and cheering. Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, placed a wreath upon Lors's head and was just about to lower the gold medal around his neck and prepared to pose with Lors for pictures when, As one witness reported, someone called a halt to the proceedings with the allegations that Lors was an imposter and had cheated. The cheers quickly turned to boos. Lors smiled, seemingly unbothered, and claimed that he had never intended to accept the honor. He finished only for the sake of a joke. With the strychnine coursing through his blood, Hicks had grown pale and limp. But when he heard that Lors had been disqualified, he perked up and forced his legs into a trot. His trainers gave him another dose of strychnine and egg whites, this time with some brandy to wash it down. They fetched some warm water and soaked his body from head to toe with a sponge. After the quick sponge bath, he appeared to revive a bit and quickened his pace. Over the last 2 miles of the road, wrote race official Charles Lucas, Hicks was running mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lustrous. The ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, and his knees were almost stiff. He began hallucinating, believing that the finish line was still 20 miles away. In the last mile, he begged for something to eat. Then he begged to lie down. He was given more brandy but refused tea and water. He swallowed 2 more egg whites and walked up to the first of the last 2 hills and then jogged down the incline. Swinging into the stadium, he tried to run but was reduced to a staggering shuffle. His trainers carried him over the line, holding him up while his feet drug on the ground, where he was finally declared the winner. It took 4 doctors and 1 hour for Hicks to feel well enough just to leave the grounds. He later declared, "Never in my life have I run such a tough course. The terrific hills simply tear a man to pieces." Hicks and Lors would meet again at the Boston Marathon of 1905 the following year, which Lors won without the aid of anything but his legs. One fair official called the running of the race the most difficult a human being was ever asked to run over. After the race, many argued that the marathon was too dangerous for the competitors and should be abolished. The director of the 1904 Games and the organizer, who wanted to use the runners for science, admitted that the event probably wouldn't be back in 1908, although it inevitably was. He later went on record and stated, "I am personally opposed to it. It is indefensible on any ground, although historic." In conclusion, I honestly don't have much left to say about the 1904 Olympics, other than the fact that I'm truly baffled America was ever asked to host again, much less as soon as 1932 when it hosted the Games in Los Angeles. I mean, after all the shenanigans and utter disorganized mess that went on in 1904, if I had any say in the planning and implementation of the Games, America would be one of the last places I would even consider to be in charge of holding such a historic and prestigious event after this one.